Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. First time just me and Nate chatting, so that's fun. So a little bit of background on this episode. I have been invited by a publication in the United Kingdom called The New Statesman to write an article that kind of lays out this Wendell Berry, Christopher Lasch style philosophy, and the term that they tossed to me as a term to explore is left conservatism. And when they pitched this to me, I hadn't ever heard this term, and so I was thinking, like, basically, is this the doomer optimist term that we've been missing? And so then I tossed it to our some private conversations between some of the doomer optimists friends. And as I'm writing this article, Nate offered to be a sounding board where we can kind of riff on this term together. Part of the problem, I think, is that in most of doomer optimism, we're not trying to be explicitly political, and also we've kind of intentionally avoided labels. But when I'm trying to explain the way of thinking to an audience, you actually necessarily have to use words to write articles, turns out. So the point of this episode is just going to be a sort of riffing on the different political traditions that we resonate with. And of course, it's not, me and Nate aren't going to be the end all be all of doomer optimism, but we do want to we resonate with a lot of the same ideas, so we want to riff on this term, and then just see what we come up with, and maybe will help me write my article and maybe write some future pieces. But this is going to be I really love the tradition. Patrick told me that essay in Spanish is the ensayo, which is translates as an attempt. And so we're just kind of making an attempt. We're tossing these ideas out there. We're going to see what we come up with as we work through it. And then, keep evolving our ideas. So anyways, welcome, Nate. I think people know you, so you probably don't have to do an introduction. But yeah, where do you want to start?
Well, plot twist. We're going to lay out an ideology, an official doomer optimism ideology. Here it is. Get ready. Write it down. Manifesto coming soon. Just kidding. No. Yeah, I like the way you said it. This is we'll riff on this and play with it because obviously, we're not. I'm look askance at ideology and will continue to do so. But like you said, we need words to discuss things, and so many of the discussions and conversations that we have revolve around issues that really are political. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with politics. That it's important, but being able to engage in it in sort of a creative and generative way, and instead of the really, really, really stuck, ossified, not at all dynamic way it has been. So hopefully, from my point of view, we can just kind of play with some ideas. I don't feel like kind of doing this. I'd not like when you threw out that term left conservatism, I was like, oh well, that's kind of fun. I like the idea of synthesizing
I lost you for a second.
there.
Yes, you like the idea of synthesizing opposites.
Yeah, and this is much like last night when Elon Musk ruined apparently, I don't know, I didn't follow it closely, but Ron DeSantis, a Twitter tech problem. Elon is messing us up right now too, because I have Starlink, and and I just got it, and I just put up my installed the satellite, and when I put it up, it was clear, right? But then that was before the leaves leaved out in the trees, and so now I need to move it because it seems like it knocks me off every time. So Elon's fucking this up too.
Yeah, right. Elon
Who
ruined
hired this
everything.
guy?
I know, seriously. Maybe, and I guess it would also be good to as we start this conversation, to just lay out that in my opinion, in general, politics, I don't really have a prescriptive idea of how politics should play out I think it's the opposite of the way that I think to even say something like some sort of national or international policy would be some like universal good thing. I think politics, by and large, should be as local as possible, self-determined as possible. And so I don't have like, my point isn't to make a political prescription, but instead to just kind of riff on scale and then riff on, I guess, some of the values that basically
Mm-hmm.
what more or less what doomer optimists are sort of coming to the conclusion that there are certain sacred things. What are those sacred things? And I think talking about that is something we haven't really delved into much. I think we've danced around it a bit.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, uh, yeah, that that resonates with me. That's an interesting place to jump off of, just right into, what's sacred, because I know for me that's something that animates well, my whole adult life, really, like kind of having a sense of what's really important and then trying to sort of in some way maintain fidelity to that. And then I think sometimes that has in my life and in the life of many, many people, sometimes it gets confused with ideological questions, and you think like, okay, this particular, ideological stance is how I defend the things that I love.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people like that. And I think that's why, people get so passionate, and, angry and, riled up about politics, because it seems like this ideology represents what's sacred to me. And I think that's important to recognize, and also like a really big problem, because then it turns into this sort of like very titanic clash that you feel like, you have to defend this particular way of conceptualize something in order to defend everything you love. And it pits people really against each other, who I don't necessarily think need to be. So if we sort of break it down, instead of like by ideology, break it down to like, well, what's really important?
Right.
There might be various ways to defend that, and there might not be as much conflict around some of these basic values as it would seem, from the surface and the way the conversation tends to go.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, yeah. An example I found this morning that I thought was a good illustration is that it seems like most people love to hate the most destructive climate change activists because they can see on the surface that it's stupid, that it's destructive, that it's even if you're meant to see the message as a way to defend nature, defending nature. Just today, their climate activists are like throwing pigment on flowers to like get attention. It's like, I I believe even in environmentalist circles, among people who are like very bureaucratically minded, they too look at that and think, this is really silly, and it's just kind of necessarily destructive. And I do think there is still even in the most spreadsheet brained people, there is still like I have a hope that there's a kernel of humanity that you can speak to, where they can kind of see like, this is silly, this is destructive, this is inhumane, this isn't really in service of like beauty and creation. And then from that seed you can kind of draw an argument about what is humane, what is human scaled, what is in service of beauty and creation. And I guess also in my article I wrote a little bit about the draft I have, protecting the weak and vulnerable, being stewards of our societies and nature. Yeah, I don't know, maybe some other just tossing things out there, if we're gonna just like a kind of constellation of values. We're a lot of us are broadly anti-war. We're pretty broadly like local and regional economies, and sort of broadly skeptical of like advancing bureaucracy in the state and advancing like global markets as like a totalizing force against basically the human scale of life. Would you add anything else to that? We're riffing on like a constellation of values.
Um, yeah. And I also want to back up, because you mentioned and I'll jump back into the values, but it was interesting you brought up the paint. I saw just that briefly this morning, but just that throwing paint on painting, just the kind of destructive almost. I understand the emotion where it comes from, but it feels like a temper tantrum that doesn't accomplish anything. What popped into my head immediately was, and I don't know anything. I didn't follow, like, I don't remember what this woman said. I don't remember anything, but I remember years and years ago, when Julia Butterfly Hill climbed a tree, right? Like she just climbed this tree. It was logging. She didn't want this tree cut down. So she's like, I love this tree. So I'm just going to live in this tree. And I compare that to like this stuff. And I'm like, well, it makes every little bit of sense to me. It's like, this is a big, beautiful tree and I love it. So I'm going to just put myself in it.
Right.
And it's a real pain in the ass to everybody, but that was so sensible. Like, it
Yep.
just was like, yeah, if you love something and you put your body on the line for it, that makes sense,
Right.
and I think that's inherently much, much more sympathetic than whatever the hell this is. And I just wanted to share that because it just, when you said that popped in my head, is just sort of like, because this is like this incoherent type of action. I think it just seems so like incoherent to me and unsympathetic,
Mm-hmm.
versus something that's like, it is connected to a value. It's connected to this sort of love of nature, love of this big, beautiful tree, and the entire ecosystem that it supports and is supported by it.
Mm-hmm.
And then doing something directly about it that's right here and now. It's like that just is a much, that's more resonant. And it's also tying it back to the value. It's directly and in a very non-abstract way tied to the value that it's representing, where it's hard to understand. It's like, what's the value that's being served by throwing paint on an old painting or something, or dumping milk on the floor in a supermarket? Like, you have to do like 4 or 5 steps of explaining to even help someone understand why
Yeah.
the hell this is even a thing that makes sense, because it doesn't make sense. So it's like, well, yeah, but then I was thinking about this and this and this and this, and this is why we're dumping milk on the floor in the supermarket where people are just trying to go get their groceries. It whatever we're doing and talking about needs to be as direct as possible, like as few verbalizations away from that your heart as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so you talk about being anti-war, which, what that looks like in practice, of course, that's a difficult question, but I think that's a direct, like a visceral, revulsion towards the, organized destruction of, young people and places. That's very visceral and easy to feel, to just experience what that means. Being stewards of land, taking care of it, and that's, again, relationship. It's in relationship with the place. It's in relationship with the land, the creatures on the land. It's embedded in that. Preparing for protecting, the weak and vulnerable. Having a local regional economy. All these things are close to home, close to your heart, close to, I think that's, you named it, that it's so much of what we talk about around this doomer optimism conversation is about scale, and is about being directly connected with all things that you love and that support, and that you support your life, and that whose support. And you get from that, the more abstract you get, the more theoretical you get, the more ideological you get. It doesn't go anywhere good, and becomes like, then you're fighting on this like second, third.
I'm gonna jump in here while we wait for Nate to come back. Oh, you're back, but I'm gonna just jump in here anyways. So
Fucking Elon.
I know. So anyways, yeah, I think there's actually something super important here that I don't think we've ever articulated, which has something to do with values being born out of direct experience, which helps you to see like the fullness of complexity, but also the fullness of like the human experience. And like people have, despite their like mental backflips, people do have this inherent, like a lot of people still have this like inherent drawn towards reflex, a reflex towards love, and like an inherent drawn away from like disgust reflex. But those reflexes get co-opted by abstract argumentation. But once it's closer, and so the scale is closer, those reflexes can get exercised more often, to the point that you sort of get to strengthen them. And then, just the iterative benefit of thinking on a scale that's more knowable, more human. You keep flexing that muscle to the point that you develop this like value system or set of morals or understanding of what is sacred over time. And I can't stop thinking about the difference between, I wrote this article recently about the Monbiot versus Savory debate, and it's basically a debate about how to understand the world and science. And if you understand the world by taking a isolated variable out and measuring it and then putting it on a spreadsheet and then taking all those isolated variables and adding them together and saying this is a system, you get a totally different understanding of what the system is than seeing it over time. But you also have a very cold relationship to that system by looking at it as numbers. And it doesn't allow you to love or be disgusted by it. Whereas seeing it over time, this is like all of our experience being on land or being parents. It's like, that there are things that can't fit on the spreadsheet, but even more than that, you care about the understanding of the system insofar as it ratchets up your strength and ability to both like, be drawn toward or be disgusted by, and then that informs morality. I mean, fundamentally, like the sacred is an iterative development. And this is where I don't know if we want to jump into religion, but a lot of religion has developed a sense of the sacred in this way over time, iteratively. We've all decided together that this set of principles is what we want to live by because we've exercised our muscle of being drawn towards or being driven away from. And we've all agreed that, a new baby just being born and a mother is a sacred dyad that needs to be protected and loved, for example. And that just, having figured that out as a community, it just allows us to kind of relax. We don't have to relitigate the sacred all the time. So that's useful. But again, the other doomer optimism question is like, we live in this modern world where we have new questions that haven't been yet litigated by a lot of those, moral frameworks. And so we're constantly relitigating and constantly, iterating on those values with this muscle.
Yeah. You said something at the beginning of this that I'm going to jump back into, and I think trace it back to that question. And this is something, because I've mentioned, on the show before, and, on Twitter and whatnot, like in my profession, I'm a psychotherapist. And a thing that I say a lot comes up in therapy, just comes up in human endeavors, is something along the lines of, if there's a conflict you find between your mind and your experience, you should always trust your experience. And I think the value of experience is exactly, like to deepen what you were saying about that. I think it's extremely true, because experience is something that you've done. Experience is born of a relationship between you and what you're doing, who you're interacting with, the place you're in. Like, that's what experience is. It's something that you are engaged in. And there's a level of, abstraction or representation, conceptualization, from pure mental experiencing. It's like a conversation, or you can meme something into your head, and all these things are sort of built um, on the scaffolding that doesn't have really a very solid foundation beneath it, whereas experience has an extraordinarily solid foundation. Its foundation is direct relationship between you and and then the other subject that you're interacting with. So when you have these mental representations and these memed and conceptualized ideas, they're very vulnerable to being just off off, not useful, in conflict. So I think whatever we're building, building it from direct experience, and as the sort of self self-proclaimed sort of hippie defender of the area, like but I'm not even the first person that, well, maybe I was, I think I said love, whatever, you said it too, but I'm gonna like come back to that again and again and again, because it's that experience of being in love with the world that you're in, and experiencing love, that I think, everything good is going to be rooted in that. It's going to be directly rooted in that. And that's not an abstract, that's not an abstraction, that's a that's a quality. And it's not a feeling, it's a choice, it's a quality, it's a commitment. So but it's, I think, the root of the experiential root of what we're trying to describe. And if we get too far off of that, that's when you're getting into mental land. And it's interesting you brought up then religion on that. And I have personally I think a lot of people we interact with do, it seems. Either it's like pretty comfortably religious, or I think a lot of us are sort of like densely ambiguous about the whole thing, densely ambiguous. I had a mentor of mine who used that term to describe how he felt, and I'm like, yeah, that resonates. Densely ambiguous, because I think when I was younger, I was dismissive, and I'm definitely not dismissive in the slightest anymore. But I think what I'm drawn to, religiously speaking, are definitely religions and aspects of religion that are extremely mystical, because I think mysticism is the direct experience of that. And that's what I value. And I feel like where I get hung up a lot is, again, highly conceptualized, religious frameworks that to me just feel like more, they're more abstractions. I'm not accusing all religions of this, and so don't think I'm saying like all religions are just abstract and blah blah blah, but there is a tendency there that I shy away from. It's like these common conceptualizations, which are useful to build a society around, but at the same time they're just sort of that consensus. And I think that when you don't share that consensus, in a pluralistic society, there's a difference between something that's a social consensus that you're using to build a social environment around, versus an absolute truth. Those aren't the same, and a social consensus can be a very powerful thing, but trying to impose that social consensus on everybody by saying this is truth, I mean, maybe, I don't know, I don't necessarily disagree with you there, and you can't make me, but I'm open. So I think there's a lot of but mysticism to me is where I get the most interested and find the most value in, because it's the direct experience of what's sacred.
Yeah, I mean, so I've been thinking a lot about religion lately. There's a bunch of stuff I want to touch back on that you just said. The religion part, I think I'm coming to the conclusion that it's just as spreadsheet brained or ideology brained to sit on the fence on this, what is really the only that I can see, the only remaining societal institution that sort of holds our traditional cultural framework that actively engages in morality, like discussions of morality. And I mean, maybe like Harry Potter, or like, there's some like comic book guys who look to those kind of worlds for morality. But I think those are also like, you have to admit, like, we're informed by Judeo-Christian morality if you were raised in the United States for the most part. And so I think it's somewhat like I'm realizing myself, like, I'm somewhat ideology cucked to just have gone to college and say like, oh, that's worth throwing out. That it has issues because it's expecting me to think one thing. I do think there's a way in which you can engage with religion that's like constantly wrestling, and I think that's actually the point. Mm-hmm. At least in my opinion, the point is to keep wrestling and not to just submit yourself unthinkingly. Not necessarily. I mean, there's some aspects of it that you do have to submit yourself to because it's literally a matter of faith, but other aspects where you're just constantly, a good engagement with religion is to wrestle. And I think it's a totally valid way to engage with it. The other thing is, I wanted to touch on the love question. One of my favorite books of all time is Erich Fromm's book, The Art of Loving. And this is like a leftist, the Frankfurt School, critical theory. But he was saying like love is an act. It's an act you engage in. It's a practice. It's not an abstract thing. It exists in actions, both between people in relationship, between people and land, between a place, and the art of loving, to me, really speaks to that question of like, what is love? It is this direct experience, and like building that muscle I was talking about before of understanding what is to be drawn, what we're drawn to, what we want to see more of in the world, what we want to protect. And then this also goes back to something we talked about very early on in Doomer Optimism, is that there is really a distinction to be made between like consumption and production here. And this kind of goes back to our industrial society critique, which is that I think most people now are just passive consumers of ideology, of what their life should look like, of what they should care about and value, as opposed to active producers of their own world, like their own existence, their own universe, what they're drawn toward, and just like leaning into that agency. I think a lot of people just need first of all just need an invitation to flex their own muscle of love and disgust, and to like work on that practice of saying like, you have the ability to, in industrial society, you don't have to be a cog in a wheel. You don't have to just consume and do exactly what you're told. You are allowed to have a muscle of love and disgust, to constantly let that guide your life. And I think like part of what Doomer Optimism seems to be like just inviting people into that practice.
Yeah, so as you're talking, I don't know, I'm going to flesh, I had this idea, I don't know if it makes sense, but
go for it.
I thought, well, you're talking about producers and consumers, and it made me think of so much of how people behave, would be like consumers of love, and we need more producers of love. And producers of love is sort of like what you're talking about. It's because I think it's sometimes we think you're acting from love, like let's say you're acting politically from a place that you think is of love, right? Because I love this thing, and so therefore I am marching to the service of this particular ideology, which is really kind of consuming an ideology and then acting from that place, but I don't think it's much done with often. Doesn't seem like it if you pay attention to how people interact around these issues, in much of a spirit of love at all. Like there's no love being produced by that action, right? Like it's a consumptive process. But if you think of being a producer of love, that means that your actions are directed and oriented towards what you love and in a spirit of love. And so then you're a net producer of love into the world. So we need producers of love rather than consumers of love. And that's sort of like when you're a producer of, when you're a producer of goods, when you're producing, I mean, I can say, I sometimes get weird. I get this, the thing people like to say, imposter syndrome. I get that a lot about farming because I've been doing it for 5 years and I don't know anything. Like really, I mean, I'm just starting to know. I mean, I know more than I did 5 years ago. I'll put it that way. But I sometimes get embarrassed because there's so many people who've been doing this their whole lives and know a hell of a lot more than me. So I don't ever really feel very silly about putting myself out there as a person who knows a lot about it, but I do have now 5 years of experience of it. And, just the act of producing in the way that we're trying to produce is a very loving act because it requires so much attention and it requires so much care, of living things, of a place, like it requires, actions that are oriented towards getting up and checking on calves and, making sure that they have all of their needs met. And, there are these organisms that you end up caring very deeply for. So there's so much love involved in the production of that. Whereas, you go to a, supermarket, you buy your steak and I mean, that's fine, but there's not, I mean, that's not, I mean, it's possible that you can like in the experience of eating it. I mean, that's really pleasure though. There's not that, I don't think, sense of love or that's sort of a missing from the consumption side of things. So more production equals more loving, and loving production is really where it's at. So we're looking to be love producers here. And,
this is a hippie episode now, Nate.
Yeah. you should have known what you're getting in for.
I know. Okay, all right, so here's what comes to mind for me. Just recently, I brought up this example, not that my marriage is like the perfect thing or anything like this, but it was, I talked to Mary Harrington about our project, our marriage and our land, for her book. And she put me in there as an example in her like kind of solutions chapter. And then I talked about this on the podcast with Eric Miller too, with regard to like Barry and Lash's writing too. But basically the short of it is, I think a lot of people think of marriage as like an act of consumption. Not only are you like consuming in the marketplace like the best possible type of person you could get on various parameters, like, oh, she's a 10 and she's like X on, her IQ is this, as if like people could just get
spreadsheet.
Yeah, it's a spreadsheet, and then on top of it it's like the marketplace, like what do I have on my spreadsheet versus what do they have on their spreadsheet, and how can we like negotiate for the highest possible like person. I think also, I think people use their, like, I think of Jeff Bezos' like new wife or what, I don't know what she is, but like, people keep with that mindset, you just keep trading up over time for different spouses at your own expense of like continuity and family and hurting everybody. But
you just said I don't know what she is, and I'm like, yeah, I don't either. What is she? I don't know. Like what are these people? I don't know. What are they?
I don't know. And then so if you think of your spouse in that way, you necessarily like think of a way in which you can, trade up. The marriage is it's dispensable, it's fungible, it doesn't matter. Fundamentally, it's one other thing you can trade in a marketplace where your life is like an endless act of consumption on the highest possible, the best possible things you can get in the marketplace, as opposed to seeing the marriage as a sort of holy relationship out of which you can build something better than you could build as two individuals. And it's, if you think of the marriage as the center relationship, as in the world of producing a family, a legacy, in our case, like a place, a home, you know, a piece of land through our stewardship. Patrick is out there right now, renovating an old ruin on our property, so it's like building, you know, some cultural continuity through our care and attention, raising our children, passing on something to them over time. All of this is a product of producing something that's larger than ourselves in service to something beautiful and loving and sacred, you know, as opposed to like love is the act of consuming. There's something really essential there, I think, in like trying to understand, we're not even talking about left conservatism anymore, but you know, in trying to understand what is sacred, I think we're hovering around it. It's being able to pay attention, to care about it. But it also is like an act of agency. There's something about agency with figuring out the sacred. It's not really, it can't necessarily just be received only. It has to be like an active wrestling. I guess going back to the religion point, like the act of wrestling makes it more sacred, in my opinion. You know, you're actually actively engaging with it and trying to figure out like, where do I stand here? How does this square with my reality, my experience?
Well, let me ask you this: how many vows have you taken in
Just
your
just the
life?
marriage vow.
Like vows?
Yeah, just the marriage vow. I think, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think pretty much me too. I
Yeah.
can't think. I mean, I it would strike me that I probably haven't taken any other ones because I would think I'd remember. Um, the marriage vow, like that's it.
Yeah.
And vows aren't really much of a thing, you know. I mean, I feel like they used to be. The vows aren't much of a thing. Like I said, I've been called to take one vow, and I took that vow, and I've been taking that vow very, very seriously, and my life is completely organized around that vow. And but it's around a vow, it's around a promise, and it's not a choice. Like I don't make that choice. I chose not to choose anymore.
Yeah.
um
Right.
like I chose, like that's what the vow is. Like there's no more choice here. Like my will is out the window as far as what I would prefer, and like it's only I you know I, and that's a powerful thing that really very much subverts um what is essentially the consumerism in a nutshell, which is just endless choice, endless choice. And I'm like, you know, and that's what we do when we take a vow. We say like there is no endless choice. I've made my choice. Moving on, we're going to build around this choice. And that is a very sacred thing. To say that I put this more you know above. I put this more high above anything else.
And
And
it's an act of faith too, now that you're speaking like this. It's an act of faith to say, I'm not going to keep relitigating this. I'm committed to it. I don't know exactly. I mean, when you took the vow, did you know exactly how it was going to turn out? Of course not,
I
but
would
you're
no, I
committed
was
to it.
23 years old.
You're committed to it. The point is that this commitment is more sacred than anything else. And so the vow itself sort of enforces a faith-based like commitment that no matter what, this vow is more important than you know, anything I could get potentially by like thinking outside of it. You don't even think outside of it anymore. You just think like, I'm committed to this. I've agreed to this. It's a promise I made, so I'm sticking with it. And a lot follows
Mm-hmm.
from that, you know, just kind of
A lot
up
does.
giving up like the constant trading up the constant like choice mindset.
Yeah, it's just not a thing. And that is, it's powerful. And it's, it's in fact, it's an extremely liberating thing.
It's true.
It's liberating from having to fucking worry about all that. Like I think about everything, right? Like I think too much. I think about everything. I just like all the freaking time. And it's very nice to have a very central part of my life that is not something that I can, that is like, it's not up for examination. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
that's, and I don't do that. It's never a thing that I do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that is liberating.
Mm-hmm.
It's like liberating in the sense that it frees me up to put my time and attention on other things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think there's something to religion with this too. Now that I'm thinking about
Mm-hmm.
it, like the sacraments, the different sacraments, baptism, communion, marriage, these are different vows you make to like being faithful to the church, for example. And in some ways it is an act of um giving up, committing to something, and then um sort of letting go of some of the constant thinking and agency, like, all right, the majority of the church has figured out this, I'm going to wrestle with it somewhat, and I'm probably never going to give up my skepticism. However, same with marriage, you're wrestling with it, you're constantly using your agency within it, but the institution itself you're not going to give up on. I don't know, I'm convincing
I
myself to be
can
religious.
oh I can totally. I'm imagining our more conservative friends listening to this and finding it really hilarious. Two libs talk about everything religious and convince themselves of it without being able to actually,
Take
you
the
know,
plunge.
take the plunge. Like, um,
No, they'll be
I
satisfied.
imagine
They'll
they,
be satisfied, I'm sure.
I
But
imagine they think it's funny, but at the same time, I would beg a bit of, beg a bit of compassion uh, around the dilemma here, because to me it feels like one
yeah,
has for years and years and years and years and years.
yeah, yeah. Um, I wonder if we want to dig in a bit to what the left brings to the table and what conservatives bring to the table, like just more explicitly. We don't have to go into like a whole, I mean, it's literally like the history of the like the civil, like our civilization, but things that resonate with us that we would broadly think of as leftist, and things that resonate with us that we broadly think of as conservative, as a way of like illustrating that this isn't as much of a contradiction in terms as you might think. And so I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking, somebody responded to Jason sent a tweet that said, what is left conservatism? And somebody responded, is sort of reconstructing traditional social structures from left principles. So anti-porn feminism, anti-tech environmentalism. The anti-tech
Mm-hmm.
environmentalism is pretty obvious to many of us. It's like these things seem opposed. In my article, I made this point, and maybe this is worth just reading out and then riffing on. This is just a short two sentences from the article. Sacred aspects of life need protection from totalizing forces. The left part of left conservatism is recognition of the need for protection from the exploitative forces of the market, the desire to commodify and sell off every last sacred thing. The conservative part is the desire to protect the sacred from the flattening authority of bureaucracy. So you have these two like overscaled institutions that
Mm-hmm.
are in opposition to the lower scaled and maybe locally determined and diverse sacred. And so I don't know what comes up for you with that.
Well, it's hard to start sometimes because you can go, you bring something like this up and people go so many different directions, and
I
like
know.
way deep into the history of political theory and whatnot, and you can find really contradictory stuff all over the place,
I
and I don't,
know.
I'm not here to talk about Rousseau and old, like, no, I'm not, I don't know that much, and I don't, it's not that interesting, and Burke and all that, but to me, it's sort of like left and right mean, I think, different things across time and place, but at least I think that it's sort of the thing that you recognize it when you see it. Like if somebody's making an argument, you can almost tell like immediately, oh, that's coming from a place that most people would sort of agree is generally a right place, and you can
Yep.
pretty reliably predict, the kind of person that person will be likely to vote for versus something like that sounds like it's more or less coming, like you just know it when you see it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting to try to unpack that, but I think we can get a little too precious about trying to unpack that with a very specific set of ideas that are 300 years old, because
Right.
that's not how, I don't think that's really how it works. I'm not saying that those ideas and old political philosophies aren't important. I think they're interesting and I think they do shape ideas, but I don't think regular people are very anchored to those, and I
Mm.
don't think the way that people experience left and right today are very anchored to those traditions, at least not very deeply.
Right. Well, and you can just keep going back and back and back and be like, well, it's really actually just the difference between like nomadism and sedentism. It's like, okay, well,
Right.
let's try to just put some scope around this argument first.
I wonder what you think about, like, the way I think of it, and it seems like conservatism is sort of a general orientation towards keeping things the same, and leftism is more an orientation towards changing things. And I think that like is very simple, but seems to hold up a lot of the time.
Mm. I the thing is, if you take that as the definition, it kind of nullifies the left conservative thing, because I don't necessarily think leftist environmentalists are trying to change things. They're actually trying to conserve nature. They're trying to conserve something. And so I think like broadly there are aspects of leftism that are they like anti-consumerist, anti Battle in Seattle, like World Trade Organization opposition. If that's leftist, it's trying to conserve something. It's not trying to change something. And so I honestly think a more salient, at least straw man to like these are what we commonly think of as the left and right. Personally, in order for me to even write this article, is the left looks at solutions in the state and the right looks at solutions in the market. And the right thinks this is broadly the most common, people who are voting Democrat and people who are voting Republican in the US. The people who are voting Republican think, let the market work it out. The people who are voting Democrat, let the state work it out broadly. And then I'm arguing that there is, I've argued this a couple of different places. There is an alternative American social tradition that sees the problems with both of those totalizing institutions and looks to scale down, looks to make something like more culturally meaningful, more spiritually meaningful, more specific to place. And yeah, and I think that's broadly where the doomer optimists live, is that alternative tradition. And this is why we're neither all of us are mostly disgusted with both political parties, is that it doesn't really represent our vision of a way forward, which is like more human scaled, more spiritually fulfilling. It's like, yeah, Emerson and Thoreau, it's Ed Abbey, it's Barry, it's Illich, it's all the people we read who talk a lot about the beauty of place, relationship, caring for the vulnerable, stewardship, belonging, spiritual fulfillment, which is not represented in either political party at all.
No, I mean it isn't, but I mean, but it is, because I think these values are so universal that they are claimed, by, everybody in politics. They claim these things um as values, and and there's certain things that just as somebody who's, been, more on the left, the thing that's always made me crazy for literal decades has been, how, you'll get lip service to, um, on the right of things about nature and about environment and things like that, when, I've never seen a GOP policy that doesn't have a net negative effect on the environment somehow. Like, that's
Right.
just what happens.
Right.
Um, And yes, there's examples in the other direction, blah 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 blah. But I'm the one talking now, and I'm going to talk about my thing. And if you don't like it, tweet me,
I love
whatever.
that. I love that.
Um, but so everybody wants to claim it, but then when the rubber hits the road, it reverts back to these sort of like uh, these very static ideologies, these very static and there is something about obviously the market versus the state. That's a big thing. I do think there's this dynamic of change versus staying the same though, like
Yeah.
and I think more on a social level, because the left is like, like, hey, we can do whatever with social arrangements, that doesn't matter, like, so if it's conservatism, it's like we need to change the way that the market is working to preserve nature, but it's still like it's kind of based in this idea of like we need to change the way we're living.
Mm.
And I think conservatives seem to really be like, hey, we need to like there's this social order to conserve, so it's around things of a social nature. It seems
Mm.
like there's more of a tendency to want to kind of stay the same versus change.
Right. Well, and actually, now that you say that, okay, so let's take this as an example. Maternity leave in an industrial society um is enforced by the state. And like Patrick said this morning, he was like, you know, I guess that would be a leftist impulse towards change, but in the direction of let's make things better in relation to industrial society to protect the sacred. And just this morning, I posted something where a Catholic, conservative Catholic, was making the argument in First Things magazine about the conservative Catholic case for single payer healthcare. So that would be another example where, you're asking the state, potentially the state, or there's other ways of doing it. Like people can buy into, get what's a cooperative healthcare system or something like that. That's what they have here in Uruguay. But the idea being that you do want things to change, but in service of like evolution beyond or protection from like modern and industrial society, I guess. Does that, like Catholic
it
workers, does that resonate? It's like you're both recognize that there's some tradition that's informing your calls for unionizing, or these kind of like more socialist leaning um power to the people organizing that are indeed good protections against industrial exploitation.
Yeah, we're coming back, orbiting around, I think, to your sort of initial question, which is, like, what are the sacred things to protect, to build around, and then, it's like, well, whether we use the state to do that or whether we use other institutions, the market, things that like that's all the business of ideologues, and I'm interested in like, well, okay, let's first define, what's really, really, really important. And then, I guess at this point, I mean, I've been, over the course of my life in different spots on this, but I guess I really don't care about how we do it at all.
Do
If we
what?
can agree, protect, build around these things. Like, what are
Mm.
what, agree on what's actually important. Um, and I know that's people will listen to that and be like, well, that's a terrible oversimplification, because if you know what's important, what good does that do? It's like, well, a lot, actually.
Yep.
A whole lot. And, and and then let go of the idea that, well, it has to be done this way, this is the way that we have to do it, right? Like,
Mm.
that's the part I think I object to, is we get to really tightly define this way. No, that's a state solution, we could never do that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, in this context, that might be the solution for some of these, that might be the way to ensure that people have access to healthcare. Like, it might just be the only way we can actually accomplish it.
Right.
It might not be feasible to do it another way. um but what was that list? I wrote down, to protect the weak and vulnerable, stewards of the earth, anti-war, stewards of, ecology, the earth, our ecosphere, whatever, anti-war, local, regional, production, I think being, producers, rather than just consumers. I think that's a huge one, because that really ties into the corporatization of everything,
Mm-hmm.
and how we're just are trained to be consumers from the moment we are born, it seems like.
I know. This is a weird, you said this before we started this, but people are against consumerism. They can see that it's like spiritually unfulfilling, but the moment you talk about any kind of like expectation that they would consume less or produce anything at all, they get very mad. So I'm
Yeah.
so the other thing that I'm navigating, and I guess the whole point of the podcast too, is thinking about the audience. Like, who are we talking to? Who are we trying to bring in? How do we do it gently? And it's, I mean, the same thing is true for me of like religion or morality more broadly. Like, I'm not going to convince anyone by just harshly judging them and yelling at them and saying like, I'm in, you're out, I'm moral, you're not. It's just not gonna resonate. That's not how you proselytize. If you're trying to get what I would call a spreadsheet brained leftist to understand the concept of the sacred, you kind of have to go slowly and like introduce some concepts. Like, we understand that consumerism is spiritually meaningless, is spiritually unfulfilling. So use that language to start. And it can start people down a path like we've taken. Not that we're perfect, but once you start exploring, okay, well, this seems like a dead end. What other options are there? Taking more agency in your life. You can, what we were talking about before, flexing those muscles of like developing your own morality through love and disgust. I think that's good, but I think you really have to I'm trying to write this article. I'm trying to think about a general audience who's used to, what are my two political options? It's either the state or the marketplace. And I'm trying to suggest like maybe there's another way that has a lot to do with like, building local culture, self-determination, pride of place, like building relationships, having agency, being a producer. Oftentimes I'm sure you've had this conversation where you're like, just the act of production is really empowering. It also is very, the ability to self-determine your own fate is something that can really be a good check on the state and the market. And then people will say, then you'll like give an example and people will be like, oh, we're going to change the world by having chickens. Like, does it scale? And then you're like, I've ruined my whole argument because you've said some stupid small scale example. And then they think, well, this is stupid, I'm just going to throw this away. Like, I'm only used to talking about solutions at the global scale. Those are the only things I'll take seriously. This is not a serious argument. That's another thing I struggle with a lot, is trying to illustrate it without making it sound like insignificant, which it's not. It is totally significant, but it's hard to describe why it is. A whole society being more producing, having more self-determination, more agency, more human connection, like how that isn't actually insignificant at all. It's extremely significant, but it's very hard to make that argument to the spreadsheet brain, I guess.
Very hard. So in the term, left conservatism, you've got, right, so the opposites, and we're talking about the union of opposites, the synthesis of opposites, and that's done, in dialectic. It's done in relationship, and right, like that's what's missing. I mean, a lot of time, like, it's like we present politics as this struggle, this war between two opposing forces. One vision needs to win, when it really needs to be a conversation between two viewpoints,
Totally.
to find a synthesis. Not like, the market or the state should win. No, that's bad. You want them, you need them both.
Yeah,
It's not like
or the past return, or the hyper future technological future. Like, there could be a synthesis of these things. Totally.
there must be, change or progress, like progress or concert. Like, no, it's solution, like integration, synthesis is the only way forward. Like, need like I wouldn't want, even when I think I was at my most left. I mean, I even think at that point I wouldn't have said, well, no, the left, I just want them to win totally and completely. That's horrible.
Yeah.
That's and even if that were to happen, you would see, something else emerge to create this tension. Right now, it's like this war, one idea, one versus the other, and I think that can't lead to anything good. So there needs to be a conversation between the two. But in order to have a conversation between the two, and this is the part I think that's really broken right now, is in order to have a conversation between the two, you have to have a relationship, and you can't have a relationship when there's, like just basically, hatred and in sort of an absolute sense that, like, well, my ideological opponents are evil.
Right.
Like they're not wrong, they're evil. They're
Right.
and so there's like this basic trust that, in humanity, that's just like gone. And it's like, well, no, my team's correct, they're evil, and this is a fight to the death. There's no conversation, there's no synthesis that can be found right there. And so,
Yep.
like, that's so I keep coming back to process variables rather than sort of like um not a surprise, I guess, rather than an ideology, rather than like, this is what it is and this is how you define it.
Mm.
To me, it's like, well, no, what's really important here is a process. So left conservatism to me might be more of like a process of engagement, with not making assumptions, the worst possible assumptions about the people, about an idea that you find yourself in disagreement with, a person holding an idea that you find yourself in disagreement with. Instead of approaching that person, making the worst possible assumptions about where they're coming from, and then treating that as your enemy, it's a process of engaging with that.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, there's maybe a left conservatism in my mind, because we get to make this up right now. We're not beholden to anything. It's less about what it is and more about how it's done.
Yeah.
Which I really believe that's what's drawn me into doomer optimism, and that's like what I sort of play with in practice here is the process of it. I mean, I enjoy very much, like, for instance, John, Neil, Roland, people that are right, that quite honestly I probably wouldn't have got along with a few years ago, but being in relationship there,
Yep.
I still probably don't agree with them about. I mean, I know I don't agree with them about a lot of stuff, but I found things that I do quite a lot agree with, and it's that process of engagement that I think is much more important than a particular policy position.
Right. Well, and I would, and to add to the policy thing, like I was arguing this morning about, there's only one correct morality. It's Catholicism or whatever. And I said, I'm sorry, but I will never think it's morally correct. I think it's morally wrong to go to some village in Japan full of Shintos and tell them they need to be Catholics. I just won't. If that makes me like not eligible to be a Christian, then so be it. I think that's morally wrong. And relatedly, the way to be a neighbor, and this is like fundamentally to the process we talk a lot about. The way to be a neighbor is to be able to suspend some parts of your ego and the fences you've made to see where there's overlap and let go of some of the hardest lines you've drawn in service of like a dialectic, a co-creation. Like, outside of yourself exists society. You do have to sort of suspend your autistic sense of your like own ego being totally correct and you having figured something out completely. It is the process by which I mean, I honestly feel like the process itself is sacred. The ability to have a dialectic, to develop those things together, to have some sort of conviviality, that is the process of love. I mean, even in a marriage, you're committed to a person. I'm committed to being your spouse. That doesn't mean we're ideologically exactly the same. Quite the opposite. You're committed to the process of of love together, the act of it, the art of it. And that requires some amount of swallowing your ego, as any person who's married knows, and finding ways through the challenges. The same process, like method, could just be scaled at different scales. And this is like the subsidiarity point too, is that like those the process of working those things out should be done at the lowest possible scales, like the most knowable scale, because you can sort of see love and disgust at those levels, as opposed to once you get to like this there should be a global diet, it's very hard to see what that even means in practice. It's just so abstracted, to go back to the scale question. But okay, we're running out of time. Is there anything we need to get on the record before we wrap up this episode, where we lay out the two slightly left-leaning doomer optimists lay out the entire political ideology of doomer optimism? Just kidding.
Well, I mean, in my mind, kind of, it's we kind of I feel like we've started to come together here at the end. It's at least in my mind, and it is more of a as I would endorse, more of an anti-ideology, which isn't about a prescriptive set of how things are or how things should be, but it's a process of it's a process of engagement, that relies heavily on experience, personal experience, lived experience. It's built around relationships, and it's built around being in relationship with people with whom you might disagree. It's built around protecting human relationships. It's built around relationships between people and their places, people and animals. It's built around that the sacredness of relations between living things, and rooted in love and commitment to those things. And so if a process of political engagement is derived from those values, then I think it might produce a really different solutions ideologically. It might produce all over the spectrum, and I don't care at all, and I don't want to care at all, and no one can make me care about what those are.
Totally same.
But if they are, but there is a sort of a rubric for looking at this here. Like, it isn't just it's a process, that is derived from these values and practiced, and then it lands where it lands. But that's what that left conservatism is to me when I hear the word, I guess.
I love it. I love it. We're gonna just end there because that was so good. Thank you, Nate. So now you all should. We'll make a list, like a constitution, with those things that you just listed, and everybody now from now on, they have to sign that to be able to join us on the podcast. I'm just kidding. That was great. All right, thanks, Nate.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me to come in.